Very well. Thank you, Anisha, for introducing me. It's a pleasure to join you today.
So today we've heard a lot about what's happening in Africa, and the one thing that everyone seems to agree with is the way we're living. There are no borders now, at least in the digital world. There are no borders, but attacks also happen without borders. So, what do you think is driving the increase in ransomware attacks around the world? Is it because all of us move, you know, uh, to a digital world? Is it because there are no borders? Is it because it's more lucrative?
I think bottom line, it's greed. It's the financial gains. It's a lot easier for people to commit cybercrime. So I think there's a number of things that have made it possible. The first one being the monetization of cybercrime through the use of cryptocurrency. I'm pretty sure everybody knows about that. With the recent colonial, ransomware attack we had in the US, which took out the east coast of the US, and they had to pay 75 Bitcoin, which is roughly about $4.4 million. Apparently that 85% of that has been recovered. But having said that, if you look at the cybercrime itself, it's becoming a lot more industrialized in the sense that there's a clear value chain. There's actually business model innovation within the cyber crime syndicates. You've got people that are solopreneurs that actually go and do these things alone. They kind of, aren't very entrepreneurial. You've got organizations that actually produce platforms that actually allows people to go and procure cybercrime as a service. So ransomware as a service is highly possible today. And hence we see the proliferation of attacks across the globe. So I read an article recently. Apparently there's a cybercrime attack happening every 32 seconds across the globe. Right? So that's quite a big number. I think the other thing is, if you're looking at just in terms of legislation and regulation, I think there's a number of things that are happening from that perspective. If you look at Africa, in South Africa, we just recently gone, live with the the Protection of Personal Information Act in South Africa. And what's that doing is essentially increasing the accountability by enterprises to ensure that, customer and employee and supplier information is protected, and that people's privacy is important and taken very seriously. Now, this follows very closely with what we see in the rest of Africa. There's a number of, African countries that are actually addressing this. So I think this is a really good way to tighten and to increase the sensitivity in terms of cybersecurity. So I think that's an important step. I think the other thing is, if you look at the market opportunity in terms of cyber crime, in 2015, there was a total growth of about $3 trillion. This year is expected to grow through to $6 trillion. So that's quite a large number in terms of the opportunity for cyber criminals to now take a piece of that massive pie. Just to give you some ransomware sort of stats. I mean, I'm sure everybody knows about WannaCry and NotPetya back in 2017, which hit the globe, taking out a number of companies, some really big household names across the globe. And I think we yet to see really big attacks to come. The colonial one certainly, and as well as not a ransomware attack, but if you look at SolarWinds and Kaseya, the recent attacks, that's also signaling that the attacks are becoming more sophisticated and more elaborate to take out an entire supply chain. So I think as chief information security officers, as cybersecurity practitioners, our jobs are becoming more complex. And with increased digitalization and digital transformation across our organizations, it just increases the likelihood of being breached. So like the previous speaker said, it's not if it'll happen, it's when it happens, and it talks to our preparedness to deal with this. So I think, from my perspective, some of the things that we have to do collectively is, one, make cybersecurity a business imperative, make it a board imperative, in the sense that, the board risk committee, the board audit committee raise it and ensure that the board members are educated and are supporting you in the drive to secure the organization. There's some really good examples across the globe in terms of how legislation is driving this, but we'll talk about it further down the discussion.
Right. Suren, I'm sure this is a broad topic of discussion. Once the ransomware happens, and once you have to cough up the money, once your system is paralyzed and you don't know what to do, it does become a board issue, right? But you're saying it should become a board issue much before all of this has happened, right?
Right.
All right. So, do you think that the COVID lockdown, the work from home driven scenario, is making enterprise security more vulnerable? Now, you spoke about what is driving ransomware. Let's talk about how we can prepare. Do you think enterprises need to beef up security, but how do you do it if everybody's working from home?
Right. Look, I mean, prior to COVID, I think many enterprises were, their architecture in terms of security was based on a castle and moat type architecture. Everything was centralized, and we had very clear boundaries in terms of our perimeter. With the with the coming of COVID and the quick response that every organization had to go through to prepare for work from home, we now have very porous, perimeters, and the boundaries have changed. So it's a bit more fluid. So I think the attack vectors are very different today. With the cyber criminals now attacking the work from home user. And there's a huge focus in terms of ensuring that we've got really strong VPNs or SASE-based solutions, secure access services edge type solutions. So it's made our jobs a lot more complex, but at the same time, as cybersecurity practitioners, we need to ensure that our users are well educated, that they're taking the necessary precautions. And, given that, home users are procuring, internet services from different providers, there's no guarantee and no assurance that they all are equally protected in terms of having the appropriate safeguards, as well as the secure config that allows for secure or for safe, for a safe operating environment. So we've, as enterprise practitioners, we've got to ensure that we can add additional controls, which increases the complexity, but more importantly, it also impacts operations as well. So there's a lot of complexity. I think, from my own perspective, in terms of the organization that I work for, we've seen at least a 50% increase in phishing emails. And a lot of it has been, either split between whale phishing, spear phishing, and just general phishing. So in South Africa, we've seen that the cyber criminals have been impersonating financial institutions. It's that sense of urgency. You've got to do something fairly quickly. So it's almost bordering on business email compromise as well. So I think that's what we're seeing here in terms of our own company. I recently read a report about Mimecast, and I'm sure everybody knows about Mimecast. It costs roughly about $500,000, about $450,000 to $500,000 to remediate from a ransomware attack in the South African context. But more importantly, what was interesting was when you pay the ransom, only about 8% of organizations globally are able to recover all of their data. So it doesn't pay to pay. So paying ransoms is a massive issue. And you'll see that in the case of the Colonial Pipeline example, the authorities were able to recover 85%. And this is the reason why the authorities in the US have now, made it a requirement that enterprises do not pay for ransom, because there's no guarantee that you'll get your data back. And it's a big issue. So obviously it encourages more and more cyber criminals to now start to attack using ransomware as the attack vector. Okay.
All right. So we've spoken about the security, but what are the biggest pain points leading to the current situation? Because companies want to be safe, but employees also need to have a system which is easy to work with. At every point, if you have to reconfirm and put in your credentials over and over again, isn't productivity going to also get it?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's a number of pain points. I think the biggest pain points faced by many leaders across Africa is the shortage of skills. I mean, there's reports that I've read that range from 2 million to 3.5 million. I've seen even reports this morning that talk about 4 million people that are required across the globe. So you can imagine this is a massive problem from a global perspective. In Africa, it's probably even more magnified because the cost of education is extremely high, the cost of certifications and the maintenance of those certifications are extremely high. So it does make it difficult for new cyber practitioners to join the workforce. There's some really good work that is being done by companies like Absa Group, which is a multinational that has banking operations across Africa. And they've got an institute that now has a target of producing 300 cybersecurity practitioners annually, which is a fantastic number. But at the same time, it's just not enough when you have a global shortage of almost 4 million. Having said that, there's a number of organizations that I can talk of that have a number of internships or learnerships in South Africa. And I see this happening now growing in parts of Botswana, Kenya, Ghana as well. So I think the intensity and the support for developing the pipeline of cybersecurity practitioners is definitely there. I think it's a continental problem, and it requires the support of governments as well as the private sector to alleviate and to address the shortage of skills in Africa. But I think at the same time, we've got to lower the cost of education so that we can lower the barriers to entry. We can talk about STEM in terms of science, technology, engineering, and math skills. But the point is that the cost of education is extremely high. So we've got to do something about lowering the costs and making it easier for new entrants into cybersecurity. That's one bit. The second bit is technical debt. And I think, many of us have legacy systems, and these legacy systems sometimes are dependent on older technology platforms, like older versions of Windows, whether it be Windows clients or Windows servers. These systems go unpatched. And how do you deal with that? And I think there's different ways, but it's definitely a pain point for many organizations, including myself. The next one is the continuous evolution of the technology and the increased digital transformation that's happening across Africa. And with that comes, an increased or evolution in the cyber threat landscape as well. But more importantly, the task of the cybersecurity leaders and practitioners is to try and keep up with the pace of change. And there's a massive cost to try to keep up with the pace of change. And I think cost-effective solutions are required, but I think more importantly, we've got to architect security and work with our business and application development partners to ensure that we have more sustainable solutions. So the question is, if you're looking at the NIST type of framework, which says, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, how do we use a framework like that to help us in terms of dealing with these types of problems? The next problem is really vendor lock-in. So where you have, on-premise solutions and you're trying to look at using cloud, and this talks about, how do you move your workloads across to different computing environments, and sometimes vendor lock-in is a problem, which also increases the chances of, down the path of legacy or technical debt. The other key thing I've learned is that we've got to focus on user education. And I think, my son he's training to become a pilot, and his focus is on human performance. And what the aviators have done is they've built it into the standard operating procedures. And I think the same needs to happen from a end user perspective. So all of our users across the enterprise, there needs to be an element of building cybersecurity and cyber safety into the jobs. It shouldn't be an after the fact type situation, which we have currently. So the way we approach cybersecurity education needs to change. And I think with given an industry like aviation, which is well over 100 years, and if you compare to our modern technology era in terms of ICT that we know as, being 30 or 40 years old, there's a lot that we can take from that industry in terms of how do we apply some of the thinking and practices into cybersecurity education. So hopefully I've touched on a few sort of key pain points that many of us experience.
Right. Of course, many of those, especially regarding skilling and legacy applications. But Suren, how do companies stay on top of the innovation game? What should companies, especially the smaller ones, consider? And how do they balance the twin objectives of not getting disrupted by competition, adopting new technologies, and staying competitive at the same time?
Yeah, I think it comes down to trade-offs. Every company is different, so there's no sort of standard answer, there's no blueprint, but I think, it comes down to affordability and it comes down to risk appetite. And there could be multiple drivers in terms of legislation that will force smaller companies to do certain things. So what's really interesting, if you look at what's happening in the UK and the US, you've got the Small Business Administration in the US that has partnered with the Department of Homeland Security to assist the smaller companies, because you've got roughly 97% of companies in the US being defined or categorized as small companies, and the DHS provides free services in terms of vulnerability management and vulnerability management scanning. So there's some really good programs in the US. I think we can learn from that from an African perspective. In the UK, you've got the National Cybersecurity Center, similar types of initiatives where they've got almost like a certification program to provide a level of assurance to government as well as to other stakeholders that you've got a level of you've taken responsibility and accountability, and that you can provide a level of assurance that you have taken the necessary measures to safeguard information assets. So I think there's some really good lessons there. I think in terms of Africa, I think we can certainly learn from this. Obviously, the African context, we've got multiple countries, and the question is, how do we come together as a continent to address some of these things? Because, if we can pool our resources together, the economies of scale could certainly assist us in addressing some of these issues. We tend to, my view, and this is purely my view, is that we tend to work in silos in Africa. And I think one of the things we have to do is break down the barriers so that we can collaborate and address some of these issues, because we're all in it together in terms of trying to protect our information assets and the shareholder value that we have to deliver. So having said that, that's the one bit. The other bit is, when you're thinking about innovation, there's always incremental and there's always disruptive innovation. And so you've got to look at, I subscribe to Gartner, and in a previous job, I used to be the chief enterprise architect for a long time. So there's a number of ways of looking at it. And the way I look at it is that you've got to have systems of record. And what that means is you've got to have solutions that take care of your core systems. And then you've got to look at things like the systems of innovation and differentiation, because there's always going to be solutions that are going to help you differentiate. And maybe security is the thing that can help an organization differentiate in terms of increasing the trust level and the brand equity for your particular brand. So having said that, having models that can assist you to identify where you need to, invest. And again, I use another Gartner model called TIME, which is tolerate, invest, migrate, and eliminate. And what that really helps to do is to look at your entire set of security investments and develop a portfolio management approach to how you actually invest and manage your cybersecurity technology landscape. So that's the key thing here. In addition to that, there's a number of things that we could do. We could be doing a lot more conferences on innovation, and there could be a whole host of programs that could be driven to assist cybersecurity practitioners to become more innovative in terms of how they apply the different types of technology. So hopefully there's some insights there.
Okay. Right. And so then this is our initiative as well, to get everybody on a platform to start talking with each other, and let's hope some of those silos come down. Now, in the earlier bit, you spoke about legislation, the COPA Act that is coming in South Africa. Now, you also spoke about the US government's executive order, where the government saying don't pay ransomware because it doesn't really work. Now, can legislation, whatever we have, legislation is like an incentive for people to be alert, to be secure. Can legislation be a deterrent for the wrongdoers? Because most of the times the hackers are 2 steps ahead of us. And is this happening because there is a threat that ransomware can be used to destabilize governments and hit strategic state firms? So how do you send a strong message to the cyber criminals that you're not going to go away scot-free?
Look, I think one of the issues is that prosecution of cyber criminals is extremely low globally. Okay.
Why?
So,
why is it low? Because we don't have laws, because investigative agencies don't have a roadmap. Why?
It's a complex issue. I think with it being a virtual crime, it's difficult to actually and to gather the evidence and to work with the various law enforcement across the different jurisdictions is very complex. So obviously, organizations like Interpol, Europol, you've got really great agencies in the US, in Europe, in the UK, Australia. I think there's a level of collaboration, and you've got great companies like Microsoft that are at the forefront in terms of working with law enforcement agencies to track down and prosecute cyber criminals. But if you look at the conviction rate, the recent numbers I saw, and there might be different numbers depending on who's reporting on it, but the numbers are like extremely small. We're talking about 0.02%. So the conviction rate is extremely low, right? I think that's the one thing. So it does make it, let's just say, it does make it a lot easier for cyber criminals to continue operating like the way they operate. The other thing is, if you look at the elaborate cyber criminal networks, given the value chain, about 2 or 3 years ago, there was a call center in the Philippines, I think, that was taken down. So essentially what the call center was, it was almost like the call center for working with the individuals that have been compromised from a ransomware perspective. The call center will help them to actually facilitate the payment of the cryptocurrency. So it's a very well organized, value chain. And the way they organize themselves is very difficult to actually pinpoint and catch the kingpins of these massive networks. So again, the people that are getting prosecuted are the low-level actors that are really not the masterminds behind these massive criminal networks. So that's part of the problem. The other problem is, you're quite right, the cyber criminals have exactly the same technologies that we have, and they have very smart people working for them. So when WannaCry happened, I read an article that was based out of Eastern Europe, and they were talking about, highly skilled, highly educated, government cybersecurity practitioners that were earning between $3,000 and $5,000, the equivalent of $3,000 to $5,000 per annum, and they were being targeted by criminal networks to come work for them, earning 100 times more, moving from $3,000 to $5,000 to like $300,000 to $500,000 a year. So there is definitely a supply. And the demand is there in terms of being the fact that you've got $6 trillion that's available to, or potentially available for being taken. So I think it's again a very complex topic in terms of how do we get this right. I think when it comes to governments, another article I read recently is that in terms of ransomware, governments have been the highest hit in terms of ransomware attacks. So governments have been targeted. I think in Africa, again, it depends on the level of investment from a cybersecurity perspective. Do we have the right capability in Africa to address the potential issues that may arise from ransomware attacks in Africa? So I think, again, very complex issue, but it needs to be, there needs to be greater collaboration between the different governments around cybersecurity. Something similar to what is happening in Europe with the ENISA agency that has a focus on cybersecurity.
All right. Surendra, it's very interesting, and we could, go on talking for hours, but we're completely out of time. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives on cybersecurity in Africa and how, governments need to come together, how organizations and enterprises need to be better prepared with the security, with training their manpower, and of course, an improvement in the education, the cybersecurity education, so that the skill gap is reduced. Thank you so much for joining us, and it was a pleasure hearing you and your thoughts.